Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Leah Gibbons, and today's jam session on restoring and regenerating place is going to be on how regeneration integrates science and spirituality to create thriving cultures. So I'm going to share my screen. We'll get started. Okay, so there's me, and I'm with Regenerative Living Institute, and you can visit us at regenlive.org, Koru Collaborative at korucollaborative.com, and the emails are there, and I'll show this again at the end. I'm also with the Regen Living Ecosystem, which is a collective impact initiative, so you can check that out and see how you can get involved there. Okay, so regenerative development then is the process of developing the capabilities of whole living systems to increase continuously in health and well-being. And another way to say this is that we are aligning human consciousness and actions with living systems principles and characteristics. And so a way to visualize this is with a Mobius strip, that we are constantly working on the inner aspects of our existence as well as the outer, and they are completely connected and completely influence one another. So inner includes things like our worldviews, our values, ethics, things like that. And our outer then is a reflection of these things, a manifestation of these inner aspects. And they include things like even our language systems, educational systems, governance, economic systems, our built environments, everything in the outer world, the manifested tangible world, comes out of that inner world that is intangible and not quite manifested, right? Not in physical form anyway. And so the inner influences the outer to a much greater degree than the outer influences the inner, but the outer does still influence the inner. So think about where you live. If your community or neighborhood is designed in a way basically where people are not encouraged to associate, right? Like where I live, we live on pretty big lots, like an acre or more. And it's kind of an effort to go visit your neighbor, right? You've got to walk a little distance, and people are generally in their houses a lot, but not every community is set up that way. A lot of the communities are set up so that there are very small or no yards. Like if you want to go outside and recreate, it's in a communal space, so you're going to be interacting with your neighbors, or maybe you have some other community assets that you use together so you can have interaction. A lot of times the houses are set closer to the street and sidewalks, so people are outside walking and interact. Right, so in that case, you're probably going to value your interaction with your neighbors and that communal life. Whereas if you're living in a neighborhood like mine and you pretty much never see your neighbors unless you really make an effort, you don't really value that communal life as much. So that's just an example, right? But this inner impetus, right, to live more communally or in community, right, then can help us create an outer existence, a tangible existence that reflects our inner values. And so this really is what we're doing in regenerative development, when we're shifting our consciousness very intentionally to create a different outer manifestation of this connectedness of source, spirit, spirituality, and science. And so this brings us to our topic, right, of integrating science and spirituality. So some terminology. Let's talk about how we're defining spirituality here. So I like to define it as the awareness and experience of belonging to the larger interconnected community of life, of the purpose and meaning of life within this context, and the development of personal and community values and actions that arise out of these. Okay, so then if we're looking at this definition of spirituality, some things come to mind and should be practiced, like reciprocity, right, where we recognize that there's mutual exchange, dependence, action, and influence within that community of life. Then there's also responsibility, right, the state or act of being responsible, answerable, or accountable for something within one's power, control, or management. Right, if we're in a community of life where everything is interconnected and our actions affect everything in that community, we need to be responsible for those actions. And so then if we can implement these this responsibility, reciprocity, within this community of life, we can create vitality, the life force and capacity to live and develop with meaning and purpose. And we can create prosperity, right? The condition of thriving, growing, and developing vigorously for humans and for all life. Right, so if you think about it then, spirituality and science, they actually have a lot in common. Now, science, we often define as a systematic way of discovering and organizing information or knowledge about the world and how we experience it. Right, so we're probably all familiar with things like the scientific method, empirical data, which is kind of observable data that anyone can observe and look at, in contrast to like our inner experiences that only we, can report on. No one else can tell us about our inner experience, right? So science likes to have things that a lot of people can look at, right, and describe in a very systematic kind of way. But now we have fields in science like quantum and unified field physics, ecology, transpersonal psychology, consciousness studies that are following scientific methods and that are coming to the same conclusions that spiritual traditions have told us and taught us for thousands of years. So it's a very interesting time, right, where we have these spiritual traditions that have been around, as far as we can tell, for as long as humans have been, right, that have certain teachings, and they use certain terminology. And their way of knowing things is a lot more about, again, like our inner individual experience, although in spiritual traditions and practices, we also have communal experiences, right, that are shared together and that people can talk about and discuss and tell that we've all had the same experience. That was fundamentally a spiritual experience. Now, science, right, using its own methods and terminology, is coming up with ways of understanding the world that now are the same as spiritual traditions, right? Just kind of describing it and understanding it a little bit differently. And so here you can see some spiritual teachings, right? To be is to interbe. You cannot just be by yourself alone. You have to interbe with every other thing. And like we know this through quantum and unified field physics, right? That everything only exists because of the relationship of something to another thing, right? Like everything only exists because of this interbeing. So we know that now through science. On the top right, is this depiction of sacred geometry, toroidal fields, the seed of life, the Metatron, all these things that have been taught in spirituality, and now science is finding and able to measure the same kinds of things, the same kinds of sacred geometry that exist in our magnetic fields, our energetic fields. We have now the methods to detect these things scientifically, whereas before, right, spirituality was teaching them in other ways. The bottom left is an Aboriginal motif, again, using kind of sacred geometry. And on the right, you also see some sacred geometry. So these are all from spiritual traditions. And then science, right, the same types of sacred geometry, but they have been arrived at, discovered or known in different ways, in scientific ways. So you see like the Fibonacci spiral on the top left, which very nicely describes a lot of things that we see in nature. And this is also sacred geometry as well, right? It can describe our solar system. It describes the shape of galaxies, of weather patterns on the earth, shells, flowers, the human body, like all kinds of things. You see on the bottom left, this toroidal field that's created in all kinds of places, right? Within the human body, within life forms like trees. You can extend it to bigger life systems, ecosystems, and so on. You can see sacred geometry can be used to describe humans, like human proportions, the way humans are shaped, the energy fields of humans, which we can measure now also. And fractals, the bottom picture in the middle, right? Fractals are super important in sacred geometry. They're used to describe kind of levels of existence, different dimensions of existence. And we see fractals all over the place in nature, from the smallest thing we can detect, the Planck. I wanted to talk about the Planck a little bit too, because the Planck, if we could visualize its shape, It's actually like a toroidal field. Okay, so that's the smallest thing that we can detect. And it exists because of spin and differences in spin, like the relationship of spin creates matter. Okay, so again, we're going back to this idea that things only exist because of their relationship to one another and because of all these things that are interacting, like sacred geometries and flows, changes, and fluxes, which have all been described in spirituality and now are being described in science as well. Okay, so let's bring it back around then to regenerative development and regeneration. So the inner part of our worlds, right, our inner thoughts, worldviews, how we even conceptualize like who we are and how we show up in the world, how we relate to all other life, right? Those are all the inner aspects. And that manifests our outer aspects. Again, right, like our built environments, educational systems, governance systems, economic systems, all of that. It's all a manifestation of our inner worlds. And in regenerative development design, again, we're aligning human consciousness and actions with living systems, principles, and characteristics. And another way to say living systems, principles, and characteristics is we can say life's principles. Okay, so life's principles come out of spirituality, really. You know, I call it source myself. You can call it God, you can call it spirit, whatever you're comfortable with. But there's a basic blueprint, right, for how life manifests that comes out of that spiritual place. And again, unified and quantum field physics, right, tell us this is true as well. There's essentially some sort of, I'm just going to say blueprints again, right? It's a field. It's a field out of which everything arises, everything that we experience. So we've proven this now through science, or at least we think we have, through science and through spirituality. So what we can say then is that regenerative development is really a spiritual practice, right? It's an engaged, active spiritual practice of manifesting source energy, spirit energy, this blueprint, the matrix, the field, you know, whatever you want to call it, because you can use scientific terminology or you can use spiritual terminology. We're really talking about the same thing. So we're trying to manifest things out of that field in service of more expression of life, right? More expression of source, spirit, and life. And so there are terms to describe people who are behaving this way in the world or living their life in this way. Spiritual activists is one term, and cultural creatives is another term. Right, so which one you choose, you know, just kind of depends on where you resonate more. So spiritual activists are co-creating a loving, just, sacred, and sustainable world through means that are also loving, just, sacred, and sustainable. Right, so spiritual activists are very empathetic, they're very compassionate, they put their empathy and compassion into action to build beloved communities and transform consciousness. And so you've heard me talk before about transforming consciousness is really the key thing we're doing in regenerative development, right? So we can achieve that alignment of essentially, you know, source spirit expressing itself in manifest form. So love, right, is actually an action. It's responding to others from a place of compassion and empathy and seeing the embodiment of the sacred in all beings. So again, like everything that's manifest is source manifested, is spirit manifested. It's all sacred. Spiritual activists are engaged in the present moment while being aware of the future and acting from a place of connecting with one's highest ethical, moral, and spiritual principles. So let's go over to cultural creatives because they're very similar. I think a lot of this terminology just has to do again with how you resonate. Do you feel like you're more explicitly spiritual, or are you more kind of implicitly spiritual? So cultural creatives, they don't necessarily align with spirituality, but a lot of them do. Again, they're co-creating a better world, and not just incrementally, but transformationally. And so I've talked before also about types of sustainability besides regenerative sustainability, kind of trying to shift things incrementally. And that kind of change, even though it's a good start, it's really not what we need right now. Like we have to really transform all of the systems that exist on Earth so that we can move more towards this thrivability. So cultural creatives and spiritual activists are acting transformationally. They're authentic, again, that alignment between our words, our beliefs, and our actions. We're engaging action and whole system learning, right? So again, this similarity of seeing and acting within the interconnectedness of everything, of all life, seeing the world as interwoven and connected. Cultural creatives are very idealistic, but also very active, right? Working towards achieving those ideals, manifesting them, working from local to global scales, working with principles of ecology and other scientific principles, as well as spiritual principles, working for equity and justice, right? Valuing altruism, self-actualization, and spirituality. So this takes us then to this idea of communities, which I've talked about before, that when we're working in regeneration, we want it to be very grounded in place. And there's certainly regenerative actions we can take at different scales, all the way from global down to the individual, and those are all necessary. But one of the most impactful ways people can work is in their communities, right, where they live, or if they want to create new communities somewhere or transform existing communities, all of that is great. And the community scale is really nice because, you know, it is where we live and work every day. It is where we have the most impact. So if we really want to change the world and transform it to thrivability, we can work right where we live right now in our communities. And these are biogeocultural living systems. And if we want to take on this more spiritual perspective, we can work to create eco-spiritual communities, right? Where the spiritual aspect of our lives is more explicit rather than more implicit. But even if we don't use that terminology, we'll be working to create these spiritual communities more implicitly using the more scientific terminology. And that's just fine, right? You have to work with whatever resonates for you and the community you live in. Let me go ahead to the next slide. So regenerative communities can be, like I said, more eco-spiritual. They can also be just more towards the scientific terminology and thinking. But they all have these things in common, right? That we understand that we are partners with the rest of life in a co-creative dance. We are acting as conscious catalysts for all life to thrive. And we're using practices that integrate science and spirituality to do that. We develop the inner and outer regenerative capacities like I just talked about, right? Of working on the inner self, even as we're working on everything that manifests out of the inner self in the outer realm. So we have to work on both at the same time, inner and outer. We understand the places we inhabit very deeply, and we align ourselves with nature's and source's life-giving principles. Right, so this is place-based action, right? That we have to understand what makes our place thrive and how to put in place those capabilities for the place to manifest ever more thrivability, ever more health and well-being. We also understand our community's unique character and purpose in the larger communities we are part of. So in other words, every community is part of larger communities. So think about your neighborhood, right? It's part of probably a larger area in the town or city where you live. And then there's the city. And then there's probably a bigger metropolitan area. And then there's a bigger kind of what we call landscape in ecology, landscape scale that we're looking at, and a bioregion, and so on. So all of these scales, I've talked about this before, they're nested and they affect one another. So even as you're working on yourself, your family, your community, you're understanding that as you do that work, the work at those scales is positively impacting the larger scales. This is one of the key characteristics and principles of regenerative development that we'll get into in a second. Yeah, so here are the principles, and I've shown you these before, but I just wanted to show these now as a demonstration of how spirituality and science can integrate in ways that people can relate to. So this is a more scientific way, right, of integrating science and spirituality. And it's based mostly on the language and the understanding of ecology and systems dynamics and things like that. So the three main principles: wholeness, change, relationship, right? And as I go through this, you can probably translate in your mind to more spiritual principles also, right? That everything's connected. So we're always working in wholes, not in fragments. Because if you work in fragments, you're really not going to change much of anything. And the fragment you try to change will probably revert back to its previous state because the whole is still influencing it and still changing it. So change is another principle, right? There's always change. Change is constantly occurring. So we have to work with that change. And we have to understand that at really the most fundamental level, what change is about source manifesting. If you want to use scientific terminology, you could say it's the implicate order in quantum physics that is manifesting into the explicate order. And if you want to use more tangible examples, like even in ecology, things are constantly changing and life is constantly expressing itself in higher, more complex ways. So things like systems thinking, panarchy, right? They tell us the same thing in different language, that this is constantly happening. And part of change, again, is that we're growing these capacities to continually manifest or increase in health, well-being, and vitality, right? So that is the goal, life expressing more life. And then we have relationship as our final meta principle, okay? And so I talked about this before, how things only exist in relationship, right? Things are only manifested like out of the field, out of source, call it whatever you want. Things only manifest from that field because of their relationship to one another. And so the same is true even if we take an ecological lens. Things only exist in relationship to one another. So in regenerative development, then that means we're always looking to add value. So in other words, the thing we're working on, whether it's yourself, your community, your project, we're always looking at how can that, myself, my project, so on, how can that add value to those larger scales it's a part of? Because in nature, in spirituality, that is really why things exist, because they're an integral part of the whole, because they add value to the whole. They add something to the whole that makes it healthier, more well. And so that's what we need to do in regenerative development. And a way to do that is to create mutualisms and guilds, right? So these are diffuse networks of reciprocal relationships where all life is benefited because of these relationships. And then we can look at what are called nodal leverage points. So in this web of relationships and relating, there are places where the energetic connections or the flows will be very, very strong. And so we can work on those nodal leverage points then, where we have a lot of energy coming together, a lot of flows of physical things as well. And we can change those nodal leverage points to create greater health, vitality in the whole system. I would love to give you examples of this, but I'm going to open it up for discussion. And if you want to ask me for an example, I could give you one. But first, I want to talk about some regeneration supporting spiritual practices, because a lot of these are things that I'm sure you'll recognize, like we do anyway in our everyday life. And so the key then to sort of putting these into practice in our own life, in our communities, and supporting regeneration is that we have a context for how to do this, right? That we don't just sort of implement spiritual practices only for the aim of, personal expansion or growth, which is great. Like we need to have that, absolutely. But also, as you just saw, there's this bigger issue of doing that to support all life, not just us, our little, individual, what we think of as our individual self, because that's not how it is. We are part of these larger communities. And even as we are growing and expanding spiritually, we're supporting that growth and emergence in everything we influence. So if we have a context, then it's much more powerful. And this is why I created things like the Regenerative Community Development Framework and like the Regenerative Leadership Program, so that people can learn how to do this in ways that are maximally impactful in their communities and in their life. So some of these practices are nature-based rituals and ceremonies, right, which a lot of us already participate in. But since the beginning of humanity, right, we have been involved in nature-based rituals and ceremonies around things like the solstices, full moons, new moons, just all kinds of things. Then there's seasonal rituals and ceremonies. And again, these have a lot to do with those things I just mentioned. And as humans kind of became more agrarian, they started to center around more agrarian practices, but they were still very much tied to nature and seasons and so on. And then there's meditations. Of course, there's so many different kinds of meditations we can do. So some are much more geared towards activism, like spiritual activism, and some are more geared towards your own personal growth, which is fine. We need them all. Sound, okay, right? So we know sound is a creative force of the universe. And we know that sound can, for example, structure our physical reality and influence how it behaves. So this is a very exciting aspect and field of science right now, that we're learning a lot about how sound manifests and creates things. And so we can use sound, again, for our own spiritual development, but also for communal spiritual development and to actually influence matter. And then dance, right? Similar kind of thing. And also moving the body through things like yoga and dance and so on, actually generates like energetic fields that can shift reality as well as shift our own internal physiology. Then there's breath work, right? So there are a lot of different kinds of breath work. They achieve a lot of different things. Some of the more extreme kinds can alter our states of consciousness so that we can be aware and open to things that we don't see with our normal or perceive with our normal 5 senses, right? There's so much more out there that exists beyond our senses. So things like breath work can help us shift that consciousness and tap into those other, I'm just going to say dimensions of existence, right? Those things that are there, but we can't perceive with those 5 senses that we have. And then there are things like vision quests, sweat lodges, and so on, right? The humans have been using, again, for our entire existence to shift our consciousness and open us up to these other dimensions of existence. And then things like sacred medicines can help us with that as well. So again, these are things humans have been using forever to help us with this. And when we shift our consciousness and we can tap into this like larger field of existence, that is when we really can know, right? And not just with our minds, but our whole being and our hearts. Like we can know that everything is connected, that everything is one. And that whatever we do to the other, we do to ourselves, because there is no other in self. It's all one. It's all one field of interbeing. And so I'm talking right now from the spiritual place, but again, we know this through science as well. So this isn't just like, foo-foo out in the clouds kind of language or idealism. Like this is real. Okay, so here, I'm going to take this off in just a minute so we can have a discussion. But I just wanted to let you have a chance again to look at the websites and the emails in case you want to contact me. The Regenerative Community Development course, again, we offer introduction and certification levels for that. So that'll help you, again, kind of manifest and work within a framework that will help you express your spiritual activism and your cultural creativity through a framework that's proven to work to help shift cultures to be more regenerative. And also the Regenerative Leadership Program, we have a lot of different levels for that. And that program really speaks much more intentionally to our spiritual development and to stepping into who we really are as spiritual beings and using that to serve the world and to serve life. So I encourage you to check those out. There is a regenerative leadership course starting in mid-July. So if you want to join that, definitely get in touch with me. And I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can have a discussion.
Yes, I would love a discussion because I feel what you share is super important. It's so needed in our world today. And I would love for you to kind of give us this example. You talk about this nodal leverages point. How do you see that in practice in regenerative communities in different points of the earth? Maybe that's what you are suggesting. Like if we place this kind of nodals and we do practices in these different stages, it would be like a different impact Could you
Yeah.
please?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so some of the best examples are kind of a larger scale. So I'll start there and then I'll bring it down to a smaller scale. So for example, I did some work in Hawaii and we were working in an entire city, but really it was like a watershed, so between mountains. And so the approach on those huge scales where you have to really transform everything, like every aspect of how we live, the best way to do it is to find these nodal leverage points, because that people can get behind those and they can get excited and they know like, okay, here's a place to start. And then everything connects to those nodal leverage points. So in this case, it's water, because it does rain very often, it's Hawaii, very wet. And the way the water moves through the landscape, it connects literally everything. So even from a spiritual perspective, like water is super important. So it falls in the mountains, it goes down through the mountains, and with it, it brings life, right? Like moving seeds and organisms and so on. It moves chemicals, it moves energy. And so it goes from the mountains all the way down into the ocean. And they're having issues in this Honolulu area with the water because, it comes so fast. It's running off now because invasive species have changed the landscape. So the water can no longer kind of absorb into the earth like it used to. And a lot of it has been paved over, with impermeable surfaces like concrete, rooftops, and so on. And so there are issues with the canals that were dug, right? Like humans altering the landscape in ways that we thought were beneficial, but actually are not beneficial because we don't follow nature's patterns anymore. And when you don't follow nature's patterns, that's when you get into trouble. So taking all this quick runoff, trying to divert it into canals, which are failing, and finally into a huge canal, the Alawai Canal, which is overflowing, and it's very toxic. All those chemicals are moving in there and the water's toxic. Like literally people cannot touch it. And so what we found was that by trying to get the water to follow its natural course again, where it will spread in the landscape and it will sink into the landscape and nourish it once again, right? We're starting to change the thinking already, the consciousness that water is a nourishing life element that should be used as such. And then we have issues like food, right? Food security. And now with the prices of food going up like they are, the prices of everything going up, many more people are interested in how to grow their own food. So we can use that water that normally would run off and put it back into the landscape to do things like grow food or to create rain gardens and increase biodiversity, right? So that's like another aspect of living systems we have to look at. And that'll clean the water as well. So it'll replenish the aquifers. And by the time it does seep out finally into the ocean, it's clean again. And also the water that does make it into the canals and then finally to the Alawai Canal will be much cleaner because you're not putting as much in, but also you're cleaning it basically with living systems right before it gets into those waterways. So then by looking at food, like how can we grow food with this water? You start to incorporate a lot of other things, like you're bringing communities together and they're creating social bonds. They can create local economies right there from those food systems that will expand to all kinds of other aspects of the economy. You can look at how to increase biodiversity that way, because we have to look at the native plants, like restoring native ecosystems and getting rid of the invasive species, which there are so many, not just in the uplands and the mountains, but also in these waterways and just throughout all of Hawaii. Right, so those are just a few examples of the connectedness that's happening there, but we could keep going. I mean, this connects to every aspect of our life, like I said. Then one other good example that's a slightly smaller, well, it's actually a similar scale, is an eco resort in Mexico that implemented regenerative development. And so what they did, they are in a tributary, like a wetland, essentially. They have a different word for it, but they're in a very important area that's a wetland. So they could build the lodge, the eco resort, not in the wetland, obviously, but what they did was restore the wetlands, which required that they restore and regenerate every connecting watershed, right? Because water is coming from everywhere. that impacts this wetland. So they couldn't restore it without working with all the other aspects of the watershed, all the other geographical locations of the watershed, and also all the other social systems of the watershed. And so they started working with the local town that was near them, the governments, and they shifted agricultural practices to become regenerative, because there were a lot of, just conventional agricultural practices that were polluting the waterways and the wetland. And so they helped to shift those agricultural practices to become more regenerative, which not only helped improve the watershed and that wetland, but provided a better quality of life for the people living there, right? Because we know that regenerative agriculture is, once you get it going, there might be some inputs initially, but once you get it going, it's much more economically beneficial, as well as environmentally beneficial and socially beneficial than conventional agriculture. So, people are very much in favor of this once they understand how it works and how it can benefit them and the environment. And then on up the watershed, like through the rivers and the estuaries, the creeks, and so on, similar practices had to be implemented of shifting agriculture and also restoring some of those waterways. And then out of this agricultural shift also became other economic shifts. So local economies began to be strengthened because more people were coming back to the area to live there rather than fleeing to go live in cities to make money. They saw that now they could make a living where they grew up. So they would come back or they would stay there. And then they started making just kind of local cottage economies and businesses with products that were regenerative, like from the land, nourishing to the land, and that they could sell to a lot of people who came to the eco resort, but also locally and also globally. What else shifted? So also they helped to improve the educational systems in the area, right? Because when you have a new model of how you're going to live, then you have new educational needs. You can't keep educating people for a system and a lifestyle that no longer exists or that you don't want to exist anymore. So the educational system shifted. Also, when visitors came to the eco resort, there was a lot of education of the visitors, and the visitors now are able to take part in a program to support these local regeneration initiatives. So there's like a regenerative fund that they can contribute to voluntarily, but also part of their fees when they come to this resort go to that regenerative fund. Okay, so those are two big scale examples. Okay.
I do want to say that it kind of feels like this is almost should be Regeneration 101.
Yeah, it is. It's I know I need to play with the language a little more and the concepts, but and this is why I'm so excited about this regenerative leadership program, because it's very explicit about linking these two and about developing ourselves spiritually so that we can be servant leaders within this regenerative framework.
Yeah. I mean, I can see presenting this video as before we start, everyone watch this.
Yeah.
And then
yeah,
go ahead, Letty or Leah.
And it's cool because even people who don't consider themselves spiritual necessarily, right? When everyone can relate to science, right? Oh, okay, quantum physics tells us the same things that spiritual practices and teachings do. That's pretty interesting, right? Or ecology, right? It's everywhere. And when I finally made that bridge between the worlds, that was huge for me. So I think for a lot of people, it could be that way.
Yeah. And then, Letty, go ahead.
I think it's there is a point in life in a scientist's life, right? When they just feel that science cannot answer the fundamental questions they have, and they try to develop these kind of frameworks which are higher in value in a way. I don't mean science is not valuable, but there is a point I feel in all these super known scientists that they feel they need to create these kind of frameworks in a way that are more understandable for people. Call it yes, the theory of the unity of the everything of anyhow. So it's there is a point in life when you come to this conclusion that this is super linked and you cannot separate one from the other. So I really like we can just implement these kind of frameworks in this way. and think about life in this unity thinking.
Yeah. I mean, even books like this one, like Science in the Akashic Field, right? Written by a scientist, right? And like who in the scientific realm uses the word Akashic Field? Like that's a very like new age spiritual kind of thing. But there's science that supports it also. So yeah, it's very exciting.
Well, and also that slide on the practical applications, it's like we're starting to use those in our meetings, like on real estate development and cooperative development, we'll have rituals and meditations and breath. I mean, we'll start to incorporate that into the daily practice of co-creative regenerative development. So yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, like just to open a meeting with people doing Om together or whatever, like it just creates this like field of coherence that's important in our work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Guess I'll see you next week.